Hi, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. On this Shabbos, when CBST marks the upcoming Transgender Day of Remembrance, it's an honor to add my voice to the beautiful voices of lived trans experience in this community that we have heard and will hear throughout our davening tonight as we remember transgender and gender nonconforming people who have died young because of their identities or expressions. Some of you were here last night for our annual Rosh Pinah gathering when I introduced some Torah from this week's parashah that I think is particularly relevant for the times for CBST, for LGBTQ plus Jews, for Americans, and for our friends all around the world. The more I think about Parashat Vayeira, the more I think about the importance of its lessons around speaking truth to power, what we can learn about that in this week's Parsha, what we can be challenged by about that in this week's Parsha. In this week's Parsha, God shares with Avraham that God intends to destroy the 5 cities of the plain. Sodom and Amorah are the ones that are most commonly recalled. And Avraham is not shy in calling God out. A deal is struck. If there are 50 righteous people, God agrees not to destroy the cities. What if a few are missing, Avraham asks? 45. There's some back and forth, down to 30. If there are 10 people who are righteous, that's the, what do you call it, best and final offer. And the deal is made. Avraham is right there in the divine presence and has been reminding God of God's own job. Shouldn't the judge of the earth deal justly? Avraham's rhetorical question to God. Shouldn't the judge of the earth deal justly? Avraham has spoken truth to power. God, you are the model of leadership, and I am calling upon you. I am calling you out so that you, God, will lead by example. The first-time reader might feel hopeful, but after getting Hashem to agree that the 5 cities will be spared if just 10 righteous people are found among them, God still destroys the cities because even that minimal threshold was unattainable. The last extended episode in this week's parashah is Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. This story of faith and family, of vulnerability and violence is so significant that not only do we read it this Shabbat each year, but we read it on Rosh Hashanah, and many Sidurim even place it every day in the morning service as a meditation. It is so central to our tradition. This time, HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't tell Avraham what God intends to do. Rather, perhaps in the middle of the night, God comes to Avraham and tells Avraham what to do. Kachet bincha, take your son. The Midrash imagines Avraham's hesitation. Kachet bincha, take your son. But I have 2 sons. Your only son. Well, each of my sons is the only son of his mother, the one whom you love. You know, I do love Ishmael and I do love Yitzchak. Isaac. Oh. Kachet bincha et yichidecha asher ahavta et Yitzchak. Take your son, your only son, the one whom you love, Isaac, and offer him as a burnt offering on one of these mountains. But this time, Avraham does not call God out, as in the earlier story. Yet Avraham, by traditional accounts, passes this greatest of all tests. Not a hesitation, Abraham complied. It's from Emily Dickinson's poem, I think, 12 stanzas. Abraham to kill him was distinctly told. Isaac was an urchin. Abraham was old. Not a hesitation, Abraham complied. Flattered by obeisance, tyranny demurred. Isaac to his children lived to tell the tale. Moral, with a mastiff, manners may prevail. In the story of the Akedah, we end up with a living Yitzchak. Whether Avraham is actually stopped before yielding the knife to his son, or whether Yitzchak is actually slaughtered by his own father and subsequently returns to life, is a matter of debate in the traditional sources. What is not a matter of debate is the gravity of each of these two stories, of Sodom and Amorah and of Akedat Yitzchak. Each day, we encounter opportunities to speak truth to power when power is false, when power is corrupt, when power is oppressive. From relationships with family members, or the remark in the gym locker room or on the street, to the rhetoric of decisions made by the highest institutions of government, there are many opportunities to choose to speak up or to choose to remain silent. Silence equals death, our queer tradition teaches, a teaching reflected across many Jewish texts as well. But there are times, it seems, when silence is also self-preservation, when silence can be strategy, when silence can sometimes be planning for the long game. Transgender Day of Remembrance reminds us that the stakes continue to be high for how we respond to power and how we respond to the abuse of power. Surely, if more people had spoken up at the right time, we would not be memorializing hundreds and hundreds of homicides around the world, probably even more countless people who died by suicide around the world, people who are trans, people who are gender nonconforming. And the numbers that haven't been reported, we can only imagine how many more people there are. However, choosing to remain quiet, quieter, or even silent at times may not be the most identity-affirming choice, my friends have taught me, but sometimes is the only choice, just to get through a moment, just to live a little longer, and just to survive. We who inherit these stories of biblical characters, we who imagine the first Jewish family, have the privilege of studying Avraham and Sarah's strengths and foibles over and over again, linking our experience to theirs, being able to hold those experiences at arm's length, being able to put them inside our hearts, our souls. We have the choice for how to engage them day after day and year after year. But Avraham and Sarah are just Avraham and Sarah living their lives. We have generations, millennia of commentary about these stories. When we read the Rashi about this week's parashah, our greatest Torah commentator validates some of the questions that we have to this very day. But as one rabbi said, Avraham did not have the Rashi. Avraham did not have the story on his own playbook, right? Did not have a playbook to kind of figure out every moment of his life in real time. These are in-between times. We like to talk about these times at CBST. We like to lift up the word liminality to describe when something is not quite here and not quite here. The Ben Hashmashot time, for example, when it's not quite daytime and not quite nighttime each evening. And here we are after an election, but before an inauguration, at a time when some people are focused on the conclusion of an intense communal Shiva period for those who were devastated by the election results. And others feel like perhaps they need at least a full shloshim, 30 days of mourning. And we don't have the Rashi. We don't know the fullness of our own playbooks yet because we're here in it. There's a Pirkei Avot text that perhaps many are familiar with that points to these liminal times. It describes the very first week of creation and imagines that at that very first twilight, in those first 7 days of creation, there were some miraculous things that got created. The mouth of the earth that swallowed Korach, the mouth of the well that Miriam had with her that gave us water wandering through the wilderness, the mouth of the donkey that speaks in Parshat Balak, the rainbow, the manna that nourished us in the wilderness, the staff of Moshe, the shamir that carved out the stones for the shrine, the letters inscribed on the Ten Commandments, the style of the writing and the tablets themselves. Some say also demons, maybe the grave of Moses, and the ram of Abraham, our father. And some say, this is my personal favorite, tongs, because the first pair of tongs had to be made with a pair of tongs, right, from the... Avraham spoke up the first time. Avraham did not speak up the second time. Even though he did not speak up the second time, the ram was still there, waiting for him, appointed from the eve of the first Shabbat at the very first creation, waiting for millennia to be a substitution for what could have been the sacrifice of Abraham's own son. The rainbow was also created that sixth day at twilight. What else was created then that the text does not record? Queer utopias? Gender and agender affirming communities? The courage of trans women of color? Coalition building? Imagine what tools have been waiting for us from that moment before the first Shabbat, from that moment when a perfect world was created. And now, in our imperfect world that we may be quite afraid may become worse, let's imagine the ram, imagine the rainbow, and again, even imagine the tongs. And let's start to try to tune into what tools have been there all along and how to gather them up. Because the stakes are high and the time is now. Shabbat Shalom.